Given a choice of two gods, by which one will you be more awestruck? A God who can fashion like a carpenter, or a God who could just say, light be?
I've got the unmatched Terryl Givens here in the studio with me. We are going to be talking about probably the most fundamental core difference between Latter-day Saints and other Christians, the nature of God. We talk about God as, someone who is all-powerful, all-knowing, and everywhere.
Yeah, I think all three of those terms get us into trouble. If God's moral universe isn't our moral universe, then what's the use of any of this? The fact that that question can even be in dispute is the most severe evidence of a going off the rails of Christianity. I think the core of the nature of God was taught by John, whoever the author of the gospel attributed to John was, along with the first epistle. And so in my reconstituting of Christian history, as I'm working through it, I begin with a baseline that John was saying something about God that Christians took to be the absolute foundation of what it meant to be Christian. And John's point is emphatic. And we hear it reiterated frequently in the first Christian centuries, in an epistle to Diognetus by Ignatius, by Origen, by any number of early church fathers. And his point was this: you never knew God until we saw him fully revealed in Jesus Christ. So when John makes the statement in his first epistle, God is love, that's not just poetry. What he's saying is we saw a kind of love that the world had never experienced or known. And that love was most clearly and fully revealed in that moment when Christ washed the feet of his apostles. And that, I think, is the God that is restored in what I see as the most important text revealed through Joseph Smith, and that's Moses chapter 7, where Enoch encounters a God who does not come across as sovereign, as majestic, as overpowering, as controlling. He's a God who weeps in solidarity with us, and we have a God, the Father, who is the perfect reflection of the Son that we see depicted so fully in the Gospel of John. You can go all the way back to Tertullian is maybe the first church father who asks the question, why did God create us? And from Tertullian through Jonathan Edwards, through the Baltimore Catechism, you get the exact same answer. God created us for his own glory because he loves his glory. Yeah, above all things.
Yeah, that's what we're going to be doing in heaven. Like, that's kind of the traditional Christian sense of heaven, is we're going to be glorifying God.
That's right.
For eternity.
That's right. And that isn't a caricature. These are actual statements that have been made by theologians in this, what I call the Anselmian tradition. And as a consequence, critical points of doctrine like the atonement, right, become entirely theocentric. So the atonement becomes something about rectifying God's hurt, his dishonor, or the offense to his justice, instead of being anthropocentric in the way that the book of Moses tells us God is anthropocentric insofar as...
Can you define that?
Yeah, anthropocentric meaning, right, no, my work and my glory is to bring to pass your immortality and eternal life. The fact that God declares his highest objective is our happiness and joy, the fulfillment of our capacity and potential. And
which in turn comes back around and does glorify God.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So it becomes a collateral benefit, but not his primary intent. And I think that makes all the difference in the world, because it seems to me that in a world such as ours that is so aching and hurting and yearning for some point of orientation that is beautiful and trustworthy, that the question isn't, is there a God? At least that doesn't seem to me the most interesting or operative question. A better question is, assuming there is a God, is that God worthy of my adoration and my commitment and my devotion? And I think one of the things that I most love about the restoration, as I understand its purpose and intent, is that it fully restores a God who is worthy in every way of our adoration.
Where do you think things went wrong And because it sounds like what you're describing is, God starts out as this personable being that is different from humans, but of the same kind, right?
Right.
And that changes, and it sounds like Trinity, kind of the concept of the Trinity plays into that. Can you talk about where that comes from?
Yeah, I'll say, there are two, I think, major points where much of Christianity goes awry, and the first is when, Origen, who is the most important theologian in early Christianity, and he was widely viewed as the most important voice in the Christian tradition until you get to the 6th century, and he becomes anathematized for two of his notorious teachings. One was the premortality.
I knew that one.
Of human spirits. And the second was his universalism, his belief that God would redeem everybody. So there's a great scholar of early Christianity who died a few years ago. Her name was Elizabeth Clark. I don't think she was even a believer, but she wrote a magnificent book on Origen, and she said Christianity chose a tragic path when it chose the path of Augustine over the path of Origen. And I think that's absolutely the case. So the second major figure who also became repudiated and anathematized was Pelagius. And so Pelagius alters the whole course of Christian history because he was a British monk, active in North Africa, and around the year 400, he becomes famous for a couple of his teachings, but one of them is that that we have free will. That's not unique. He's reiterated what had been always taught. And we can just make the choice to do what is right. So in theory, though never in practice, we could avoid sin. Augustine becomes alarmed. He thinks that is to depreciate grace as essential and necessary. And so he succeeds in getting Pelagius condemned. And it's at that moment, we can track it to the very year when free will becomes subordinated to grace. Salvation contracts from universal to a limited few, the elect. And the theology of ascent becomes instead the theology of a kind of descending grace instead. So I think that's a principle, two principal moments, the overthrow of Origen and the overthrow of Pelagian. In fact, some theologians today refer to Latter-day Saints as Pelagian, and that we participate in the Pelagian heresy because we so emphasize freedom of the will.
Well, that's interesting that kind of you talk about that shift from more of a universalist plan to something much more narrow. And that, for me, is one of the heaviest, most weighty principles that causes me to shy away from the traditional Christian understanding of God. Because again, as you were saying, like, I don't know that I want to worship a God that in his foreknowledge developed a plan that would condemn the vast majority of his creations to hell.
Well, that was certainly the foundational principle of the Reformation. There have been so many revolutions in theological paradigms in the last 20 years. Another revolution that's occurred, it began in the late 18th century, but it's gathered steam in the last 20 or 30 years, is universalism. There isn't a faith tradition alive in America today that doesn't have strong proponents of universalism. And, Section 76 of the Doctrine and Covenants is a pretty clear affirmation of something that we could call quasi-universalism. So that's just another example of something that was really an outlier. Very few universalists in 1800, and the landscape is just full of them today. I don't like the term universalist because I think it's too easily misread as automatic.
As no accountability.
No accountability and automatic salvation. That's never what universalists intended by the term. They meant just an unlimited opportunity extended to all. One of my friends calls it, a better term would be No-Final-Buzzerism. That's just not as elegant as a phrase, though.
I like it, though. One of the most common criticisms that comes up against Latter-day Saints is when we talk about Jesus and Satan being brothers, right? And for Latter-day Saints, at least those who have grown up in the faith, that's just like one of those like, what's the big deal type of things.
Yes.
We don't think that it makes Jesus, any less of a god, and Satan any, more of a Satan's still Satan, Jesus is still Jesus. But the traditional Christian kind of perspective is that, well, no, actually they can't be brothers because Jesus created Satan. He is the creator, and he himself is uncreated. That is his nature. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the idea, the teaching that Jesus is an uncreated being, and why that is or isn't significant?
Okay, so here's what's at stake theologically in the preexistence of Christ, right? And John is the only one who tells us, right, that Christ existed before creation, right? In the beginning was the Word. And so that's pretty much the scriptural foundation for what's called the preexistence of Christ. And so then that's why the creeds have to say, well, he was begotten, but he wasn't made. And that's the distinction that they're making. Somehow he's born of God, but not made by God. And that becomes widely accepted. And I think that's still general consensus on that point today. One direction in which it goes that does become problematic is that many proponents of preexistence, of premortal existence, will invoke the preexistence of Christ, and say, well, if he is our ideal prototype, if we are to imitate him in every way, then it would make sense that we are preexistent with the Father as alongside of him. That's like the only example I know of how that becomes problematic in other theological ways. David Paulson wrote an essay once called Are Christians Mormon? And I'd hoped he would live long enough to write a book on that. And in some ways, that's kind of what I'm attempting to do. But it seems to me there's an irrefutable convergence of Christianity on so many of these themes. I can remember once, for example, being at an interfaith conference, and I was celebrating the Moses chapter 7 and this idea of a weeping God. And this dean of theology at this school said, well, Methodists were there ages before Joseph Smith. And I remember saying, oh, are you familiar with your creeds? And he thought a minute, because Methodist creed, without body parts or passions. And he said, well, we don't really pay attention to those creeds. And I thought, okay, that's fair enough. But the point is that there's been a movement beyond those creedal limitations. And I see this with universalism, with the possible embodiment of God. I see it with the passibility of God. It's only with the premortality that I haven't seen any movement. And I've never been able to understand why that is so deeply problematic for Christians that even the most progressive and open-minded just won't go there.
So let's talk about embodiment, because that's another major difference between Latter-day Saints and other Christians. We believe that God the Father has a physical body of flesh and bone. That is not something that other Christians believe, or at least mainstream Christians believe. Correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that mainstream Christianity teaches of a God that is immaterial, meaning he's not made of matter, that a God that takes up no space, has no gender, even though we call him a him, or the scriptures refer to him as a him, exists outside of time, whereas Latter-day Saints believe in a divine fatherly figure that does have a body, that that does even have gender. What are your thoughts on that difference, and why are Latter-day Saints different, and why is it important?
So Plato, right, was a philosopher who said what is spiritual is always going to be higher than what is physical. What is intellectual is always going to be greater than what is emotional.
Because the physical is corruptible.
It's corruptible. It's
die.
Finite.
So if God is eternal, he has to be not physical.
That's right. Immutable, changeless, all right. So that's the core idea behind what's called classical theism. So when you see the way God is described in the creeds, and almost any biblical scholar or his ecclesiastical historian will say this. They'll say, look, that's not biblical. That's not the God of the Old Testament, and it's certainly not the God of John, but it's the God of Plato. And so Christianity embraces that God, and it has some advantages. I mean, I want to say there are some powerful elements that classical theism brings to the table. For example, if you're raised in the Greco-Roman world, then your gods are, they're crazy, right? They're having affairs and they're losing their temper and they're erratic. And so somebody who wants a hope of some kind of eternal beatitude wants a God who is reliable.
Stable.
And so you want a God who wakes up tomorrow the same way that he was today. And so the word then that becomes appropriated from Platonism and also from Stoicism is apatheia, right? Apatheia, which means that's where we get the creedal without passions.
Apathy.
Apathy, right, which has different connotations today. But in the early Christian world, apathy simply meant that God didn't suffer in the way that we suffer emotionally. And so that becomes a kind of point of division in Christian thought, because early on there are a number of Christian writers who are saying, well, we're drawn to the suffering Christ. We're not drawn to the passionless, remote, transcendent God. And the defenders say, well, we have to have a God who isn't subject to the frailty that we experience emotionally as humans. But by the time you get to the 19th century, the late 19th century, there's a watershed in Christian theology. And very few theologians today talk in terms of an impassible God, a passionless God, because there's a recognition, if only at the pastoral level, we want a God that we feel can experience what we're experiencing and can relate to us and identify with us. One of the complications comes into the picture because in cognitive science and in psychology general, it's increasingly common to say, well, there's no such thing as unembodied cognition, right? All cognition is embodied and all emotion is embodied, right? Been complete paradigm shifts in this regard, that emotions are bodily constituted, and that we can't separate the mind and body in the ways that we thought we could. And so a number of theologians have asked, well, what does that imply about God? And so it's increasingly common to hear theologians refer to an embodied God, although
an embodied?
an embodied God, but none of them mean that in the way Latter-day Saints do. Nobody is talking about a God of flesh and bone. And so the struggle is on to decide, well, what other kinds of corporeality might there be? And so you have some people like Grace Jansen saying, well, maybe the world itself is the form of God's body, or the church is God's body, right? Or other. But we're still pretty much alone in that notion of a body of a God who has a body of flesh and bone.
Do you think that, and I recall, I think it was Elder Holland who said something about this, don't quote me on that unless I'm right, that sometimes Latter-day Saints focus so much on the separateness of the beings of the Godhead that we miss out on opportunities to talk about their unity or their oneness. Does that statement resonate with you?
Yeah, I think it does. Clearly, there are elements of what sound like Trinitarianism in the New Testament, especially in the great intercessory prayer. And here I'll say this is probably one of the most beautiful aspects of Trinitarian thought, is that we see love modeled in the Trinity, that they become difficult to differentiate because they are so in harmony and so self-sacrificing on behalf of the others. Christ suffering for the Father suffering to watch it and to send him. So I think that's one of the beauties of Trinitarian thought. I think one of the dangers is then it becomes possible to say, well, God doesn't need us, we're extraneous, because he feels the fullness of love within the Trinity. And that is a direction that a number of theologians, Anders Nygren, the most famous, have taken.
And then you have Christ saying, just as I am one with the Father, I want all of you to come and be one with the Father.
Yeah, exactly. So that seems to me to be saying, well, we need to be seeing the Trinity in some ways as a model that we're to emulate. Yeah.
While we're talking about the Trinity, when we say that God the Father is separate from Jesus Christ and separate from the Holy Ghost, naturally the discussion becomes, well, that's polytheistic. How would you respond to that?
I'd say, yeah. And, I don't have any problem saying, well, no, actually, we believe in a plenitude of gods, but we worship one.
As long as there's that understanding that, because I think the term polytheistic comes with a lot of baggage, right?
Yeah.
And people are thinking about that Greek pantheon of gods competing against each other, the kind of the paganism aspect of it. And that is not at all what we believe.
No. And I'm just surprised that social Trinitarianism hasn't caught on more in Christian theology, because I think it's what most people intuitively believe.
Even when they say Trinitarianism, they're kind of imagining.
That was my experience teaching Catholics in South America, was that they always assumed that, no, God the Father is a distinct entity from Jesus Christ. So I think there's that intuitive. But the only theologian of real standing that I'm familiar with is Jürgen Moltmann, who plainly espouses social Trinitarianism. He says, well, clearly they have to be distinct centers of consciousness. And if they're distinct centers of consciousness, then they're distinct persons. And he believes, and I think there's a lot to this, if I can just jump back into early Christian history, there's a fusillade of criticism that emerges early on, 2nd, 3rd centuries, against Christians. We have a Greek named Celsus, we have a Roman named Porphyry, another Roman named Lucian, all of whom are saying, you Christians seem to be really confused because you can't figure out if you're worshiping one God or two. This comes up again and again. You claim you worship one, but you put Jesus up there. And so I think that was the first kind of great theological dilemma the Christians had to wrestle with. They of course, they're all Jewish, right, to begin with. And so they're not going to challenge monotheism, the Shema, right? The Lord God is one God. And so the Trinity kind of emerges as a way to finesse that problem.
Kind of a response to Jewish claims that, wait a minute, you guys are polytheistic.
It's an affirmation of Jewish monotheism, of recognition that Christians have introduced another character into the Godhead. And Moltmann seems to suggest that maybe too much was compromised by, and I think we create more problems than we solve in the Trinity. For example, if they're completely one and united, then one problem you get is, so where's Jesus Christ's resurrected body now? How does that get reabsorbed into the Trinity? 2 is, how can you have a distinction that Christianity will insist upon, that Jesus is passible, but the Father is not? That's even a heresy, patripassianism. How can they have contrary aspects to their nature if they're one nature? So I think there are as many problems created as resolved.
Quite the paradox.
Yeah, and paradox becomes an explanation for so much, right?
Sure.
It's just a paradox.
We can never understand that he's unknowable, right?
Yeah.
Which is discouraging.
I think the first great dissenter from Christian orthodoxy was, he was from Pontus, a place in Turkey in the 2nd century. His name was Marcion. Now, he had a lot of screwy ideas.
The Marcion heresy comes to mind.
Yes, exactly.
I don't know what it is, but I've heard the term.
Okay, here's the heresy. First of all, he was anti-Semitic. 2, he rejects most of the New Testament. 3, he doesn't believe God or Christ actually had a physical body. But what I think he was right about, he said, Jesus represents a new revelation of God's love. And he said, this can't be reconciled with the Old Testament. I think he's right if we take the Old Testament literally. And so he throws out the Old Testament. But he has a huge following. The Marcionite church continues for a couple of centuries because the idea is so innately appealing that we can reside our faith in a God who is only love, not retribution, not vengeance, not judgment. The way that Tertullian, who's kind of the bulldog of the early church, that he responds to Marcion is he said, well, your God, if he's just characterized by love, his love, unqualified love, is unreasonable. And God has got a reason, so he has to love within reasonable limits. Now, some people found that really persuasive. I don't. I think that's kind of the definition of love. It's unreasonable. It's uncalculating.
That's the love of a parent, right?
That's the love of a parent. There's nothing reasonable about a parent's unqualified love. But here's where things, I think, really go south. And that is increasingly what you will hear by way of defense is, well, God's goodness is not our goodness. Or Augustine will say specifically, his justice is not our justice. And so this, I think, becomes one of the great fractures in Christianity. And for a while that becomes, I think that's the dominant strain until the 17th century. This emphasis on the incomprehensibility, the hiddenness of God's justice. The most powerful counter to that, I think, comes from Elie Wiesel in response to the Holocaust, where a character in one of his plays says, if God's moral universe isn't our moral universe, then what's the use of any of this? That's a sentence with so much poignance and tragedy behind it. And I think the fact that that question can even be in dispute is the most severe evidence of a going off the rails of Christianity. You know, you have to answer the question. And here's part of what I'm doing. Like, I know we should, it's all about building bridges. And it's about appreciating and having holy envy for others. But at the same time, the world deserves an explanation of why Christianity has launched crusades and pogroms and inquisitions and why it has terrorized dissenting Christians. And that can only have happened, I think, if, as Tom Holland, the great historian, has said, moral chaos results when love is cut loose from its theological foundations. So you can't just do anything and say, well, that's just a different kind of love. But that's what Christianity has done. Why are you burning him at the stake? Well, God's love looks. Why are you damning infants to hell? Well, we don't understand God's love. We don't understand God's justice.
We're doing it lovingly.
We're doing it
out
lovingly.
of love.
So I think this is my most scathing critique of Christianity gone awry, is that a whole history of abuses became possible once we say there is no continuity between God's nature and our nature, between his moral universe and our moral universe. I think that's morally incomprehensible. I think it's intellectually indefensible. What purpose or meaning can life have if we are aspiring to a set of standards that God himself does not embody? And that was the problem that was first posed by Marcion.
And this leads me to the question, Latter-day Saints believe that, the traditional example is that we are the acorns and he is the oak tree, right? Whereas traditional Christians believe that God, whatever he is completely separate and different from what we are. What is talk about the significance in that divide?
Yeah. A good bit of Christian revisionism, theological revisionism has looked again at the question of creation ex nihilo. And the way I read it, there's a general consensus that creation ex nihilo, the most important study on the subject, concludes that it didn't become orthodoxy until the third, going into the 4th century. Until that time, you had divided opinion, but it was quite common to believe that God worked out of pre-existing materials. I think that there is more significance attached to this debate than I think Christians often appreciate or Latter-day Saints do, and that's for this reason. I believe that the principal motive behind the victory of creation ex nihilo was that part of it is this reaction against Gnosticism, but part of it is, given a choice of two gods, by which one will you be more awestruck? A God who can fashion like a carpenter a beautiful piece of furniture, or a God who could just say, light be. It's not a coincidence that the privileging of the quality of sovereignty over love emerges simultaneously with the development of creation ex nihilo theology. If the paramount quality of God is love, then that's about intimacy and connection and interrelatedness. Sovereignty is about distance, right? The king keeps his distance from the courtiers. There are, right? It's significant that in the Middle Ages, do you know that it's only in the Middle Ages that the clasped hands become the symbol of petitionary prayer? Because it's borrowed from the public display of obeisance to a sovereign. That's how you show you're inferior in acknowledging. Now, look, I believe God is sovereign of the universe, but I don't believe he thinks that's his most important attribute. I think he believes that his capacity to love infinitely is. And so creation ex nihilo emphasizes distance between, right? Kierkegaard says there is an infinite qualitative difference between God and us. I don't see what purposes that serves other than a kind of abject humility and deference, which has nothing to do with paternal love. As I've been reviewing the history of universalism in Christian thought, there have been two associated implications, two implications of around the question of universalism. And one is a long-standing view that, look, we are such thick, recalcitrant, fallen individuals that we need to be shaken into a recognition of our wickedness and our perfidy. And that's kind of the Jonathan Edwards approach, Calvin. And the other is characterized by a guy whose name was Salvation John Murray, who becomes converted to universalism at the end of the 18th century. And he writes in his autobiography, "The moment I transferred my allegiance to a God who wanted to save everyone, my heart just welled with love for everybody." So I think that that it's conducive to a greater discipleship if we have uppermost in mind the expansiveness and the inexhaustibility of God's love. It means you're just as valuable as I am. I don't have to wonder, are you the elect? Maybe I am. And so we lose those kinds of differentiations.
And that's a terrifying thought to think, are you, I'm saved, but are you going to suffer for eternity?
Yeah. I don't know if everybody's going to be saved, but I believe there would be something deeply flawed in my character if I didn't hope everyone would be saved.
Another essential difference between Latter-day Saints and other Christian faiths is that Latter-day Saints believe that God the Father is paired with a companion, a heavenly mother.
Yeah.
Can you talk about where that idea comes from?
Excuse me. Yeah, well, it's clearly there in ancient Israel and environs, right? The idea of a feminine divine. She has many different names as one goes through different periods or incarnations, right? Shaddai, there's a growing sense that the word Shaddai, which is the God who is usually invoked in the context of Abrahamic interactions or covenants, means God of the breasts. That's what Shaddai is taken to mean by many scholars. Catherine Keller give one example. Asherah is a figure that appears in all kinds of sculpture and texts in ancient Middle East. There are even preeminent, these aren't fringe thinkers, right? Preeminent scholars are writing books called Did God Have a Wife? Another one called God Had a Wife. Now, I think one concern that some people have today is that we are making claims about Heavenly Mother. I don't think that's what's going on. I think what these incarnations or versions attest to is an irrepressible yearning that humans have to find a feminine aspect of the divine. When young boys die in the battlefield, they don't call out for their father. They call out for their mother. Fiona and I were in a church. It's our favorite church in Europe, probably a little church in Regensburg, Jakobskirche. And we saw this magnificent panel, two scenes of the Last Judgment. And in one, a multitude of souls are being conducted down to hell by Jesus. And on the other side, a multitude of souls are being led up to heaven by Mary. And so I think the Catholic cult of Mary is, again, a reflection of the fact that no matter how kind and gentle and loving Jesus is, a feminine version would be even more nurturing. So just as we find many, many antecedent versions of premortality in Christian thought, and I'm not claiming, nobody else is claiming Origen was teaching true doctrine, but it's an indication of this theme that is just there in the consciousness and finds expression. And Latter-day Saints are not the first, but we're the most expressive in saying, no, we believe in a literal feminine embodied God. But others in the 18th century were saying similar things. Some of the Unitarians were, the Quakers had their version, and Moravians had their version. And so one finds that idea floating about in the modern age.
We talk about God as someone who is all powerful, all knowing, and everywhere, omnipresent. How does that belief in omnipresence mesh with our belief that he has a body and that he is physically located in one place?
Yeah, I think all three of those terms get us into trouble, even though they were used in the first year of the church, but those were just imported from Christianity. I don't think we believe in an omniscient God in the sense that we necessarily are required to believe that he knows the future. I find the argument very compelling that if free will is real, then the future doesn't exist yet. And so there isn't any future to be known. In terms of omnipotence, clearly seems to be a sense in which God is self-limiting, because if he's weeping, then things aren't unfolding in the way that he would like them to unfold. So he limits himself and allows agency. And in terms of omnipresence, God can't be omnipresent in the body. And so, of course, we fall back on the idea of the Spirit as not being embodied, or the Spirit of Christ as this element that fills the universe and effectively fulfills that function of omnipresence.
Clearly, there are a lot of differences between what Latter-day Saints believe about God and what traditional Christians believe about God. Oftentimes, traditional Christians will look at that divide. There's a lot of places where we overlap, but there's a divide, and they say, therefore, you're not Christian. What are your thoughts on that claim?
I think one just has to understand there are two very distinct ways in which Christianity has been defined. And beginning around the year 2000, there were a series of statements that came from the Catholic, came from the Methodist, came from the Baptist, all explaining why they don't accept Latter-day Saint baptism. And in every case, it was the same. They don't accept the Trinity. And so one can, I call it creedal Christianity, and that is the Christianity that comes out of, Chalcedon and Nicaea. And in that sense, no, we're not Christians. But Jesus said the definition of Christianity is, well, if you love one another, that's how you'll know that
you're my disciples.
You're my disciples.
We know that the restoration is ongoing. What are some questions that we don't necessarily have answers to yet? Or maybe some questions that you're looking forward to being answered at some point in the eternities?
A question that just begs to be asked. If we revert to that understanding of what I've called the theology of ascent, which we subscribe to, and we actually anticipate that in some distant epoch we will attain to something like godliness. And yet, most of us would agree, especially the aged among us, I'm still infinitely far away. And if there has to be opposition in all things, in the sense that there have to be alternatives and opportunities to choose and contending imperatives, then it seems to me the next phase is going to look a lot more like this one than maybe we've thought. Because we're not going to become more like God by just sitting in celestial schoolrooms and learning more theology. So I think we have to anticipate, I hope and expect, a continuing arena of struggle and challenges.
Are you thinking just challenges in the sense of learning, or are you thinking challenges in the sense of temptation and sin and whatnot? Well,
I don't know if one could call it sin. You can, but here's another way of thinking about it. Thomas Rogers, one of the greatest souls in our church who died, about 2 years ago. He wrote a work which it was published just shortly after he died. And it was a play in which it was centered in the afterlife. And complicated plot, hard to quickly summarize, but his point was, we go through the veil, we encounter people from our life, from past generations, across divides of misunderstanding, hurt, conflict. And we all look about us expecting that God is going to come to litigate these differences. And in his depiction, we find no God who's going to serve as referee. That's the first point. Second point, one of the most enigmatic things Joseph Smith said was, if you have no accusers, you will enter heaven. I probably have a lot of accusers whom I've unintentionally or intentionally offended and hurt. And if we take Joseph Smith at his word, then we're being told, no heaven for me until I've been forgiven, not just by God, by every person who has a grievance with me. That may take a long time to work out. So I envision a heaven in which all conflicts will have to be resolved through the same hard work of introspection and repentance and change that we're engaged in here.
That's a great thought. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that before, because I think we oftentimes just view God as, bring the people together and say, all right, you did this to this person.
Right. You were right, you were wrong.
Yeah. That's an interesting thought, though. Thank you for that. How has your understanding of God as a Latter-day Saint and your relationship with God or relationship to God, how has that affected your life?
Well, I would like to think of Christianity this way, that the purpose of Christianity as a system is to create the optimal conditions for us to develop an understanding of and love for God, and to extrapolate from that love to a universal charity. So I believe that in my case, of my personal path of discipleship, I believe that the weeping God, the God of section 76, this expansive vision of human potential that will be extended to all, Jacob 5, the Lord of the Vineyard, I think all of those teachings have created the conditions in which I have found it. I have found my own quest to experience God more successful, I think, than it would have been in the absence of those teachings. I don't think correct belief gains us any standing anywhere. But the reason, and I think it was Elder Uchtdorf who said this some years ago, that theology matters. And theology matters because what we believe about God shapes how we act with respect to God and with respect to others.
It's your theology that might send you on a crusade or to bring some cookies to your neighbor.
Exactly right.
Terryl, thank you for being here.
Been a pleasure.
This has been fantastic. If people watching want to discover a little bit more about the Latter-day Saint conception of God and our relationship to him, I highly suggest you go watch this video, this interview we did with Casey Paul Griffiths, in which we talk about the King Follett discourse and becoming more like God, or the idea that we can become like God. It's a really great conversation. Go check that out and have a great day.